All right, we are in Numbers chapter 17. If you want to go ahead and be turning your Bibles there, Numbers chapter 17. We touched on some of this coming out of the situation with Korah and those who were with him and God's judgment and the earth opening up and Moses' prediction that that would happen and their rebellion against God, which we've seen has been a recurring pattern for Israel and has prevented them from coming into the promised land. And of course, that second generation will come on and be able to do so. So, after all of that, after the situation with Korah, and by the way, did Korah have a special work God had assigned him? Yes. Who was Korah and some of those with him? What was their work? They were right, furnishings. Right. So early on in our study, we talked about the fact that all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests, and that wasn't just like Bible trivia for you. The reason that's important, well, there's a lot of reasons that's important, but as you move through this story of Korah, he is a Levite, but he's not a priest. But what does Moses say he wanted? The priesthood. I mean, he says, you know, basically what God has given you is not enough in your mind. You want more, which is interesting because that's the very thing that had been said by those who were in rebellion, that Moses was trying to grab too much authority and more authority than what he really should have had. And of course that wasn't the case, and we have read about Moses being a meek man, being a humble man on the earth, and really as far as those kinds of descriptions, who else do we read about in the Bible that's described as being meek? Jesus, yeah, that puts him in very good company, doesn't it? So we have this whole thing going on. We've seen rebellion before, but it seems like it's just ratcheting up. It's been several years since some of the things from the past had happened, but still not so long that there should not have been an understanding of what's going on. Okay, with all that said, how does Israel respond? Because you're probably thinking, if I'm sitting there looking at Korah and the earth swallows him up, what was their response? Because you would think that the response would be, oh, we have really missed the boat here, and we certainly want to be humble before God, and we want to follow Moses' leadership and Aaron's leadership. But what is their response? Yeah, so what did they say? Yeah, here we go again. So, Moses, this is all your fault. You know, our brethren, yeah, they died. And even though this is a direct judgment from God, there's no question. In fact, Moses had said, if this happens, and he tells them what's going to happen, but if this happens this way, then you know this is not me. This is from God. And they turn around and say, this is your fault, Moses. Okay. But as that occurs, what happens? The plague. Remember we talked about the plague spreads. And what does Aaron do? Yeah, that's right. So you have this fragrance, you might say, or sweet-smelling savor that he's trying to spread from a ceremonial standpoint. And does he save a lot of folks? Yeah. How many died that day, though? At least 14,700. There's quite a few here. We've seen a lot of death, hadn't we, from the standpoint of judgment. But you see God's mercy even, and this is going to set up everything we're going to talk about today in chapter 17 and 18. This, you know, when you look at Numbers, it's easy to see God's wrath. It's easy to see God's judgment. We also need to see His mercy, and we continue to see opportunities for that if we just look for it. So God allowed Aaron to do that. That's not against, it's not that it's against the will of God, but it shows a lot of courage on the part of Aaron. So Aaron's running out and he's spreading this. He's saving as many people as he can. Now, what happens now when we come to chapter 17, and you'll notice chapter 16 tells you how many people died in that particular occasion. In verse 50, then Aaron returned to Moses at the doorway of the tent of the meeting, which we know is a very important place. It's the meeting place for God and Moses and the high priest there. For the plague had been checked. And that leads us to chapter 17. So at this point, what then happens? What does God do? Right, so we've had this whole situation over Moses and Aaron. And if you go, if you come way back, this seems like this has been a recurring problem, but Aaron's priesthood has also been under attack. So you have Moses' leadership, but you have Aaron and that whole Levitical priesthood. Well, think with me for just a minute about how important that's going to be in the grand scheme of things. What is that going to do for Israel? What does the priesthood do for Israel? Yeah, I mean, it's their opportunity to have fellowship with God. You think about the sacrifices and all that. What does it foreshadow coming to the new covenant? Christ. I mean, there's a lot more involved than they had any notion of here. So when you start trying to undermine the priesthood, the whole Aaronic Levitical priesthood, that's a big deal. So we have all that going on. God's going to come back and say, listen, here's the situation. I'm going to make it very clear who, you might think, well, he's already made it clear, but I'm going to make it very clear that Aaron and the priesthood needs to be exactly where I said they need to be, and Moses is the leader that I have chosen. And if Israel's going to follow me and be successful and be able to go to the promised land, they're going to have to follow my leadership. They're going to have to follow my pattern that I'm giving them because I love them. All right. So it's almost as if God goes, we've had these cases of rebellion. I'm actually going to get out ahead of any third opportunity for this kind of rebellion. And so he's going to give verification, affirmation, however you want to say that, and head that off possibly. And really that's what chapter 17 and verses 1 through 11 is about generally. So just remember that. Don't worry about, getting caught up in the details. Just know chapter 17 is another opportunity for the people to understand who the leadership is and how important it is to follow that leadership. So when you get to the end, and we're going to get into some more details on chapter 17 in just a minute, but when you get to the end of 17, 12, and 13, Israel is where they need to be to some degree. But you know how sometimes, and I can understand how this would happen, you can go from one extreme to the other. So one extreme would be like Korah. Moses has taken too much. He doesn't need to be the leader. We need to take on this, etc. So wanting too much. The other extreme, even though it's a logical response, actually a more logical response than what they had offered, would be to say, okay, let's just run away from God altogether. I mean, he's fearful. Okay. They should be afraid of God. They should be fearful if they're going to rebel. But he still wants a relationship with him. So look at chapter 17 and after verse 11 says, thus Moses did just as the Lord had commanded him. So he did. And then the sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, behold, we perish. We are dying. We are all dying. Everyone who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord must die. Are we to perish completely? Now let me ask you, is there truth in that statement? Yeah. Yeah, they need mediation. They need intermediaries. But that sets up what he's going to talk about regarding the Levites. Now let's look at what happens in chapter 17. So really, let's read chapter 18. Let's read chapter 18, and we're going to talk about it in more detail, but just get the general story here. Chapter 18, verses 1 through 7. Okay? Bo, could you get that for me? So Numbers 18, 1 through 7. God's coming back. And get the flow of the story. If you look at 17, 12, and 13, when they're saying, behold, we perish, we're dying, we're all dying, God's not going to leave them in that situation. So now let's read 18, 1 through 7 and see how he's going to answer that. Okay, just hang on to that. We'll be back there in a minute. But I want you to see God says, I've got a plan. I've got a plan that will take care of this. And there's even, some people actually are. There's a few modifications he's making. We'll come back to that in a minute that are very important. But let's go back to 17 now. What's the test? We talked a little bit about this last week. What's the test? So after all of this, God says, okay, I'm going to make this very clear. What is the test? In chapter 17. The rod, the staff. I mentioned this to you last time, but it's kind of interesting because the word here, the Hebrew word for staff, if you can see my little green dot, I don't know if you can, staff or rod, is also used to refer to tribe. And if you look at chapter 1 and verse 4 and verse 16 and verse 21, this is a significant term in the Old Testament because he's using an illustration for them to take that figuratively connects to their tribes. Okay, so with that in mind, if you just, and I gave you Genesis 49:10, Psalm 110 and verse 2, the idea of you think of a staff or rod, of God's design in the Old Testament was a figure of leadership, okay? It was a figure of leadership. So what is he emphasizing once again? They're all going to have this. He's emphasizing the priesthood of Aaron. He's going to be emphasizing that in the context. So the rods here, they're all to bring a rod. And what were they to put on the rod? Do you remember? Yeah, the name of the tribe, but we're going to see some things that happen here that are interesting. So the rods are going to be placed, once they bring the rods, they're to be gathered up by the leadership. The rods are going to be placed in the tent in front of the Ark of the Covenant law. So what's happening here is a little bit like, or quite a bit like what we talked about before. Remember those censers and how they were reshaped and they were used for plating for the ark? This is supposed to go in there. Now, anytime somebody says, well, not everybody could go in there, and that's right. But anytime if the leadership had said, okay, those who can't go in there, we're going to use that as an illustration to remind everybody of all that's happened, they had every right to do that. There would have been stories told about what's in there. And what that represented for Israel, whether it's the ark or the commandments or what we're about to read about here with these rods that are going to blossom and that kind of thing and what that would mean. Okay, so this is a natural place because that's where God's revelation happens, isn't it? We've seen that all the way through Numbers. So if God is going to say, this is my leadership, this makes all the sense in the world, this is where he always reveals himself. You can see that in Exodus. Now, in this case, he would be taking they took the pieces of wood that sprouted with life that he had chosen that indicated the staff's owner. to serve as priests. So some special things you're going to hear happen with Aaron. So look at chapter 17, if you would, and let's notice it. So he says in verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel and get from them a rod for each father's household, 12 rods from all their leaders according to their father's households. And you shall write each name on his rod, and write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi, for there is one rod for the head of each of their father's households. You shall then deposit them in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony where I meet with you. And it will come about that the rod of the man whom I choose will sprout. Thus I will lessen them from myself, upon myself, the grumblings of the sons of Israel who are grumbling against you. So we've talked about this, but when they grumble against Moses, who again are they grumbling against? God. And he makes that very clear. So Moses does exactly, what they said. So this is doing two things. It's warning Israel about rebelling against Moses and Aaron, but it's also encouraging Moses and Aaron. Say, look, I'm going to show everybody exactly who I would like for you to be. It's almost, hang on 1 minute, Roger. That verse, it's almost like God is, as far as the encouragement, saying, look, I know you feel this burden, but really this is my burden. I'm sharing this with you. And that's an important point for those who are spiritual leaders to remember, is that you don't bear this burden alone. We don't bear that burden alone. And as really, that's true of all Christians. We don't bear the burden alone, but especially when you're in a leadership position, remember, God ultimately is bearing the burden. We're just getting the opportunity to share with him in that. And that's a gift of sorts. Okay, Roger, go ahead. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, they wrote their name on the rod. Yeah, that's a good point. That's right. That's right. Okay. Does anybody have a comment right here about that? Go ahead, Alan. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Mm. Mm. That's a good point. Right. 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 Yes, that's a really good point. And I was just, when you were talking about how they could get even, and I understand there was a lot that he was having to unravel with him, but even Jesus' disciples, what does he say? You are so slow to what? Believe. And so Israel's slow to believe sometimes because their will gets in the way of God's, and that's a very good point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this staff. So the staff bears almond blossoming and almonds themselves. So you read that, you say, well, why that? And we're not really told. I mean, we don't have any specific, explicit thing to say, this is what all of those figures represent. But I do think it's significant. I mean, look at where it's going to be. Of all things, why is this happening? So let's talk a little bit about it. So Gordon Wenham, who's written a great, very accessible, readable commentary on Numbers, and he cites Genesis 43:11. He just makes the point that almond blooms with these white blossoms and its fruit were highly prized. So this would have been something that would have been an attention grabber if you have one rod and all this starts happening to it, and it happens to be the rod for the Levites, referencing Aaron. So we'll come back and notice some things there, but But notice that when Moses returns to the tent the next day, he sees that Aaron's staff, which represented the tribe of Levi, had not only sprouted, because some people say, well, that could happen. All right. So it had sprouted, but it hadn't just sprouted, it had budded, and it hadn't just budded, it had blossomed, and not only that, it was producing almonds. Now, some of that can happen fairly quickly. Producing almonds doesn't happen quickly, though. And that's the significant thing. Look at Numbers 17:8. Now, on the next day, Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and behold, the rod of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. So, when you read verse 9, Moses then brought out all the rods from the presence of the Lord to all the sons of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. But the Lord said to Moses, put back the rod of Aaron before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels. So there's that warning that you may put an end to their grumblings against me so that they will not die. Thus Moses did just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. Now that's kind of an interesting little statement, because remember the first 10 chapters of Numbers. Over and over you had that statement, but the statement generally was about Israel. They did what God had commanded. And things were going pretty good, but then they had to go on the move, and then all these rebellions and murmurings and complainings happened. And now it takes that statement about Israel, and it says, look, Moses was clearly doing the will of God. Now there's other places where it says Moses, but here Moses is a representative of God's will, and he's trying to get Israel to think like they were thinking before. Okay. Now then, let's talk about possible symbolism of this. So, most of us are pretty familiar. We see the color white in a lot of different contexts. What would that? There's a couple of things it could represent that are interesting here. Purity. I mean, we're very familiar. Even people that don't know a lot about the Bible have some notion that white symbolizes purity. So what happens here represents or should be a lesson to who God is and thus who he has chosen. So if they have been unholy and God is holy, they're not in a position to be questioning the will of God and the purpose of God and what he's decided. Also, what God wishes is that Israel would be holy, but for them to be holy before God, what do they need? They need a priesthood. And he needs his priests to be holy. So, is there another idea in Scripture that white can represent? This might sneak up on you a little bit. Yeah. So, victory. So, white in the prophets, and then when you come like to Revelation, you can probably see this in Daniel and Ezekiel. So think of purity, holiness, and victory. Now that's interesting, because where does Israel need to be going? The promised land. So to enjoy your victory, you must be holy before God. I do think there's probably some symbolism going on here that they should have taken note of. Now then, Jeremiah, let's look at Jeremiah 1:11 and 12. It's kind of interesting. Probably not the primary thing that would come to mind, but maybe it's related. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. So holiness is found in God, purity is found in God and his ways. But Jeremiah mentions something when he's called to be a prophet of God. Jeremiah 1:11 and 12. Have you got it there, Andrew? Yeah. Andrew's going to read it to us. Jeremiah 1:11 and 12. Okay. If you read that context, the idea here is that Jeremiah is doing the will of God. He's going to be preaching the message of God in a very difficult way. But God is not only pure, he's not only holy, he not only promises that his word will accomplish what he intends for it to accomplish. But he's also watching. Now, with almond blossoms, like a lot of these kinds of things, it's almost like the story of the fig tree in many ways. You get these signs of fruition. Okay. I think he may also be saying, listen, for Israel to enjoy the fruit that I have in mind, for Israel to enjoy victory, they must follow me as the one true living and holy God. Okay. Which means when I've revealed that I have leadership in place, when I've revealed that I have a priesthood in place, do what I tell you. Okay? Obey me. Because when you disobey, and this goes back to what Alan mentioned earlier, when you disobey, really you're just fighting against yourself. You're fighting against fruitfulness, you're fighting against victory, you're fighting against holiness, all the things that as God's people you want, but you have to follow my pattern. And I know I've mentioned this before, but we have a number of brethren that when they hear pattern, it's just like they think that's just the most terrible word because they have a gross misunderstanding of God's motivation in giving us a pattern. And it was a similar motivation to what he was giving to Israel. He gave them a pattern because he loved them and they could be successful within that pattern. If you just say, I don't want any pattern, I don't want anybody telling me what to do, that's what Israel did. And we know what happened. Okay, so it's Numbers, it's Old Testament. We need to learn. There's lessons here to learn, and we're told in the New Testament to learn from it. Okay. Anybody go ahead there. Right. That's a good. So did everybody hear what Daryl said? Anybody? Just if you there's a complete story told by these things in the ark and in the Holy of Holies basically for Israel about his leadership and his provision and his guidance right there. So there really was no, and I'm paraphrasing now, but there's no excuse for not seeing the story when you have visible manifestations of that story that are part of your worship to God. Is that fair enough there? Okay, anybody? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. Much like Israel could have been. Remember, because later, I forget the text, but there's several times where basically Israel's reminded, it wasn't that you were so great and God came along and said, boy, you're such a great nation, let me take you. That's not how that happened, right? So you see power of God, victory of God, and when you see symbolism like this, these kinds of things, I think it is worth thinking about because the very providing of this, whether it's this or other things, when you know it's in the idea of the ark associated with the ark, it was something that was supposed to convey a lesson, a powerful lesson, and God is the great teacher. Were you going to say? Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. Does somebody else have your hand up? Go ahead, Alan. Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty strong. Yeah. Are you making fun of my picture? No, go ahead. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. To be in the ark. Yeah, that's right. That's right. What'd you say? Yeah. I wanted to make this point to you as well. So these qualities not only are God's qualities, but they're really to be personified in the priesthood. Now we know later on the priesthood gets corrupted and all that, but it's what God wanted for the priest, which we're going to find out more about in chapter 18 in just a minute. And there's that foreshadowing again of Jesus Christ as our priest. Hebrews 4 mentions that he was sinless. There was no priest before that was sinless. I'll get you in just a minute, Terry. Chapter 7, verses 25 through 26 talks about how he makes intercession for us, but again, he is sinless, he is pure, he is undefiled, he's the ultimate priest. And when you read Revelation 1:13 through 16, remember John's initial at the beginning of his vision, he sees Jesus as the Son of Man, and it talks about him having white garments and his hair and all that. Those are all symbols for his purity, his victory over death and sin, all of that. So here we are in Numbers, but because it's a story, it's foreshadowing of the Christ that would be our high priest. And as believers, we are all priests. So we're to make spiritual sacrifices. And the Holy of Holies here would represent heaven itself, which Jesus went to as our sacrifice and as the Lamb of God to serve as our high priest. Okay, Terry. Yeah, let me restate what you said. So, and if you help me if I don't get it. I think what Taryn was saying was it's an interesting contrast or reversal, because when you look at people that were fighting against the leadership that God had put in place, Moses and Aaron, when they fight against him, you end up with plagues, which is interesting because that's what Egypt ended up with, by the way. You end up with plagues, the earth swallowing them up. It's a violent judgment that comes on them to deal with them. But when you look at God's purpose and his priesthood, he only brings, and I'm just thinking through it, Taryn, he brings these judgments on those who are causing chaos among his people and rebelling. But his will is, if they'll follow him, for there to be peace. This seems very peaceful. Even the figure of an almond and the fruition and all that seems so peaceful. And that's what God's way brings to us. If we go against God's way, which is really in our best interest, then we get the other stuff. We have judgment and, earth swallowing up Korah and fire coming down from heaven. So there's a big lesson there, that we have the severity of God on one hand and we have the goodness of God on the other. Is that pretty much it? Okay. All right. So let's move on. So in this final step, the Lord commands Moses to put Aaron's staff back in front of the Ark of the Covenant of the Law, and he says to be kept as a sign for the rebellious. And I mentioned to you, as much like the censers being hammered into the covering for the altar. So even though it's not in public view, it's certainly a reminder of the people. Okay, so God's reply to the people's frightened cries is interestingly given to Aaron. And it's given directly to Aaron. Often he comes straight to Moses. It comes directly to Aaron. So if you look at chapter 17, look at verse 12. Then the sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, "Behold, we perish, we're dying, we're all dying." As you keep reading, look at 18:1. So the Lord said to Aaron. Well, obviously, because we're talking about the priesthood now. So he says all of this to Aaron, which we're going to get into. Now, here's the thing. This is kind of interesting to me, and I don't know that I have all the answers on it because there's some different views, but regardless. So, had the Lord provided a priesthood already? Yeah. Had he made a distinction between the non-priestly Levites and the Levites who were in the priesthood? Yeah. I mean, we have some remember all that section that we kind of slogged our way through about the details of who was doing what and all of that? God had been very precise. He'd been very detailed. But now he's going to reiterate the fact that there's this distinction that needs to be made. Now then, you can see what I just talked about in chapter 1. You can see it in chapter 3. But he's going to come back to it. And it's interesting what he's going to say about the Levites' responsibility. So yeah, they help with the furnishings and all of that, but there's something else. Look at chapter 18 and verses 3 and 4. Richard, could you read that for us? Just verses 3 and 4. Okay. So the non-priestly Levites are guarding it. Okay. They were to serve not only God, but the priesthood. What was Korah's problem? He didn't want to serve anybody. He says, no, this is a gift from God for you to be able to serve. Now there's your big application. Sometimes when we think about gifts of God, we think of authority, or we think of supervision, or we think of something like that. But he says it was a gift. It was a gift to serve. Because for us, for those of us who are Christians, when we're serving, we're following Jesus. We're acting like the King. Okay. Now then, he says your responsibility is to guard the tent of the meeting so that no unauthorized person would draw near and provoke God's wrath on the nation. But something really important is about to happen. So the non-priestly Levites are precluded from specific priestly work. So you've got to leave that alone. That's not yours. If you try to do something you're not supposed to do, God's going to bring judgment. So entering the tent of the meeting or officiating at the altar or things like that, that's work for a priest to do. Give me just a minute. So we talked about there's been a lot of death, 14,700 Israelites, Korah and his associates, judgment of fire, earth swallowing the rebellious. We just talked about that. But in chapter 16, verse 21, remember Moses and God have these discussions. Before we end, I want us to get this. So they have these discussions, and God says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring judgment on who? The whole nation of Israel. And we're just going to start over again. I'm going to take Moses, and I'm sure Aaron, but I'm going to take you, Moses, but I'm done. I'm done with these people. But something here is interesting. Regarding the priesthood, who does he say, if these kinds of violations happen, he's going to hold responsible? Yeah. And the priest. So the priest the Levites are to protect, but the priests are also in a role of supervision to some degree to say, we're doing this at the altar, but I'm going to hold you accountable as leaders for those you are leading. Now, you have to keep that balance. He's not saying that, in the sense that we think of, I'm transferring some kind of responsibility, but as leaders, we bear responsibility if we've been negligent. That's his point. That if you've been negligent of doing the hard work that you're supposed to be doing as spiritual leaders, because it's a lot easier to brush it all under the rug and act like it didn't happen. I'm going to hold you guilty. And the NIV tries to water this down and say responsible. The idea is guilty. I'm holding you guilty for that. And I think that's interesting because you go, well, how's that mercy, Bruce? Well, before he was talking about bringing judgment on the whole nation. Now it's kind of down to a certain group and also ensuring leadership. He reminds the people, look, this hierarchy, are you sure you don't want that priesthood? If you're in the nation of Israel, are you sure you don't want that priesthood? Because things are going to be done in a way to protect as many people as possible. So these responsibilities of the priests and Levites are an act of mercy. Ashley, a commentator, says only they, not the Israelite community at large, would henceforth suffer death at the hand of Yahweh. We'll talk more about this from chapter 18, but when you get into 18, he'll talk about the priests and he'll talk about non-priestly Levites. Let me just look and see if there's anything. Let me just say this, but I want to hit this for just a couple of minutes. So here's some lessons that we need to take from this, I think. And that is, spiritual leaders, we don't always appreciate this, bear a weighty responsibility to God for his people. Maybe next week we could read Hebrews 13:17. That's talking about elders there. And whether our conduct makes it joyful for them or a grieving kind of process. James warns that all public teachers need to be aware of their responsibility. Look at 1 Timothy 4:16. Paul tells Timothy, watch your life and doctrine closely, persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. I want to read this, and we'll end with this quotation, but I want you to notice it with me before we stop. This is Sklar in his commentary on Leviticus, but he's actually talking about 1 Timothy 4, and here's what he says. When Paul tells Timothy to beware of his doctrine and his conduct, he says, the sense is not, Timothy, you will be their Savior, but Timothy, in the absence of faithfulness, great harm may come. Harm to you for being unfaithful and harm to them because they will follow you in unfaithfulness. So guard yourself and lead faithfully, because by faithfulness you will stay close to the Lord and you will lead his people to him, not away from him. Leaders cannot be held responsible for every sin their people commit, nor will they be if they have been faithful in their duties. But faithfulness matters. We'll stop there.